This is Kyle Cleveland with Temple University Japan's iCast, a podcast to our Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. And I'm here today with Nancy Snow. Nancy has spoken in our lecture series a couple of times. Now you're in the United States, Nancy, in upstate New York?
I am. I'm in the Finger Lakes region.
Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Sure, glad to do it. I'm sheltering in place, so it's pretty easily done.
Well, you've done quite a lot of work already. You've been in the media a considerable amount talking about this pandemic. Before we get into your views on that, could you give us a brief self-introduction?
Sure. I was born in the Deep South. That's a big part of who I am. I'm probably more in touch with that right now since I'm in the U.S. And this doesn't come up as often when I'm overseas or when I'm in Japan specifically. But I grew up I was born in Augusta, Georgia, and grew up in the Carolinas and Virginia. And I went to Clemson University because my parents happened to be living in South Carolina at the time. So I went to the local state university. And then for graduate school, I decided to venture northward and ended up at the School of International Service, American University. And that has one of the top international relations programs. I think it's a top 10 school. But I've been a professor now for 25 years. I spent a couple of years working for the U.S. government at the Department of State and the U.S. Information Agency.
And how did you end up in Japan?
Well, you know what? You've set this up perfectly because I write about this in my book, Japan's Information War, which is coming out in Japanese finally this year. But the first line of the book is what happened to me, and that is that I never chose Japan. Japan chose me.
I feel the same way.
I was not focused in graduate school on the Asia Pacific. Right. I came along in the late 80s, early 90s era, which was the Cold War, immediate post-Cold War era. Many of us were still focused on U.S.-European relations or comparative foreign policy, but I had no connection, no personal connection to Asia, much less Japan. So in 1993, while I was working for the U.S. Information Agency, I sort of fell into an opportunity to go to Japan for 3 weeks. And really, I wasn't even thinking about Japan. I'm so sorry because I love Japan so much now. But when I was presented with the invitation, I was delivering a fax or talking to somebody in an office of youth exchange. And she just said, "What are you doing this summer? Would you like to go to Japan?" And all I could think of, Kyle, was I want to get out of the hot and humid DC summer and out of the office. And I said, yeah, I couldn't say it quickly enough. And I had no idea how hot and humid Tokyo is in the summer.
Not much of an improvement in weather getting here in the middle of the summer.
But that changed my life. That's such a proverbial statement to make, but it's true. Although I didn't return to Japan for 16 years. So it's not as if I came on that trip and then said, oh, I'm moving here, or I'm going to be teaching here one day. I really sort of slipped into that more recently.
Well, you said you have a new book coming out in Japanese. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Right. It's just an expansion of my book, Japan's Information War. And that book, the original in English, I published myself. It's the only book amongst the books that I've completed, either as an editor, co-editor, or author, that I published on my own, available at CreateSpace. It's really like an ebook on Amazon. And so I didn't write Japan's Information War for the American people. It was in order to get it published in Japanese. So I decided I need the book available for Japanese publishers to see. Well, I got interest 2 years ago, and it's taken this long. I had to get a translator, publishing business, which we may go into, and media. It's much more difficult now. I should add that even before I was highly connected to Japan, two of my books, my first two books that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s, were translated into Japanese and were quite well done. And I had nothing to do with that. That was where the Japanese publisher contacted my publisher in New York. But it became a lot more difficult, even with all the books I had subsequently published, to get this book translated. And it was translated. I had a really excellent translator, and this is updating what I had to say about Japan's public diplomacy, its image branding, coming out of the post 3/11 experience. So I really began with that to the present. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the substantive content of that book and that work?
Well, I do media criticism. I do criticism of media and foreign policy. In many respects, it's taking what I've been writing about for years and applying it to Japan as a case model. I've never presented myself as a Japan expert per se. What I am, though, is a global media person. I understand how a country, whether it's China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, how they can market themselves. How they market themselves, I critique, and then how they can better market themselves. And a lot of this comes out of my own experience. I was 20 years ago representing Common Cause in New Hampshire. That is a nonpartisan citizens lobby. It's still around. It's not quite as visible today as it once was, but in those days, when John McCain and Russ Feingold were pushing the McCain-Feingold bill to get money out of politics, I had to handle all of the media requests in New Hampshire. On top of that, I was a political science professor at New England College. This was my first full-time teaching gig. And so I was welcoming presidential candidates to come and sit down and talk, and I was moderating talks like that. So I became much more aware of what is effective in working with the press. And so in Japan's information war, I'm looking at Japan's efforts to raise its international profile predominantly through government PR, because that was my background.
In my courses, I teach about the whole soft power discourse related to cool Japan. The notion that, this trades on the political scientist Joseph Nye at Harvard, who talks about a country cannot really establish its legitimacy through military force or economic sanctions, but rather through the cultural norms and attraction that it draws people to. So is your work tracked with that?
Joe Nye, because that's my field, public diplomacy. I've known him now for over 20 years and actually was in an email exchange with him 2 weeks ago. That's now producing an op-ed that will be published at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy website, because I took him to task for not having any reference to gender or women's efforts in morals and foreign policy, his new book. Now, to be fair, he's a great guy and he's such a gentleman. And I think I had awakened early, and I had read an article in this journal out of Texas. It might have been an excerpt or it was a shortened version of his book, but it was just something about seeing all the references to all these presidents. Obviously, they've all been men, but in particular, he begins with FDR. And there's no mention of the role that Eleanor Roosevelt played in foreign policy. And so it just got under my skin a little bit. And I wrote this very long treatise, a reformulation of morals and foreign policy from a feminist perspective. And then I hit send and I sent it off to Joe Nye. And I thought, uh-oh, what have I done?
How did he receive it?
He responded and he was so gracious. And he said, I've put out my perspective on this, and I urge you to put out your own perspective on morals and foreign policy. So he's given me the green light, Kyle.
Well, that's a clever way of kind of deferring any real debate about the critique maybe that was directed at him. We had a filmmaker one time show a film that was about the tsunami and the fact that this one American was tragically killed up in Tohoku by the tsunami. And a rather critical comment in the Q&A session, a person said, look, almost 20,000 people were killed in the tsunami and we're focusing on one American, and started talking about why didn't you do this or that? And the filmmaker said, well, this is the film that I made. If you would like to make that film, I'd be happy to see it.
Sure.
Which I thought was a clever answer. But maybe we should kind of set the stage for what you're criticizing here. Joe Nye's work came out of at least this initial version of it, came out of the aftermath of the second Gulf invasion, where the United States went into Iraq and all the political blowback on that. And in response to that, he argued that, President Bush had famously said, you're either for us or against us, kind of had this notion of the evil empire and then later the axis of evil with these various states. And Nye said that you can never really draw a country to you by threatening to bomb it into submission. Going back to the end of the Pacific War, the Marshall Plan in Europe, that you have to have something that draws people to you. And so this has been called, brand nationalism or cultural diplomacy. And what's your critique of that model?
Well, you're talking about soft power, which is one of the most widely used concepts out there. I was just reading a capstone project for Schwartzman College, which is also part of what I'm doing right now. And it was referencing China's soft power in Africa and comparing two countries and how China was using broadcast media to have influence. So my critique, I don't know if I would even call it a critique. It's an addition. It's sort of that we have been chasing our tails with Joe Nye's concept, but he's given us something that's malleable. And I think it's up to us as scholars, as researchers, to keep having our brains turning and not just relying on a few names there that we keep referencing. And in my note to Nye, this is the way I can explain my critique, because it wasn't a critique of soft power. It was more about, can I make an addition here? But in my note, I said, Joe, I didn't really put it like that, but I said, I took myself back to when I was in graduate school. And I said that I read Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations. Now, that's the first book that you're given. It's sort of like the Bible of international relations and political science. It explains realpolitik, realism, that there's anarchy, that states are going to play out their national interests. And anybody listening to this can look up realism. But it left me sort of feeling like, is that all there is? There must be more. So when I read the works of more critical writers, when I began to read works like Cynthia Enlow's Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. And I'm now in touch with her too. But that was a classic because it was saying that international relations is personal and the personal is international. And so it was using feminism as an overlay to international relations, that it's okay to even put part of your narrative into the story, to be a participant observer. And that's what I've tried to do with my work. So soft power, I told Joe Nye, I said, soft power really has a feminist creed to it, if you really think about it. And he could disagree with me, But the idea of influence and nonviolence influence, of relying on persuasion and appeal and things that attract. Well, do women do that? Yes. I mean, the way that we're raised, we often are doing that. I'm not saying men don't do that, but we are often conditioned as women. I know I have been growing up in a very male-dominated family with 4 older brothers, that I was to be the peacemaker, that I was always to have a smile on my face, put lipstick on my mouth, and be presentable. And don't show anger. You can cry, but don't be too aggressive. And it just reminded me of the personal aspect to soft power, even the word soft. Women are trained to be softer in the way that we speak. And I'm rather loud often as a lecturer, or I can be. But that's where I was going with that, Kyle.
Well, so were you suggesting that there was a kind of a blind spot there with regard to gender or women in his work?
Yes. And I think that whether it's intentional or not, it's okay. That's the whole point of it. It was to engage someone who's so famous in our field in more of a dialogue. And I really appreciate that I even heard back from him. I've exchanged emails with him. He even supported when I went up for full professor. He's been very supportive of my work, and I'm grateful. But that doesn't mean that I just have to agree with everything. There are blind spots in my work, but it goes back to the filmmaker. When you put something out, whether it's a film or it's your book, it's incomplete by nature. When I write an op-ed, it's incomplete by nature. Every time I write an op-ed, I have to have a point of view. I have to have some fixed point, or I make suggestions. There's a certain format that you have to follow depending on who publishes it, unless you are self-publishing. But in that case, you're going to leave things out because you work with editors. And I leave things out all the time. I either have to, or I run out of time. I have a deadline. But we have to be kinder to ourselves. Again, we're not the be all and end all. And I think as academics, we are so full of ourselves often when we're in graduate school. I thought I knew everything. I thought, oh my God, I'm about to get my PhD. And now I'm going to be Dr. Snow. And yeah, I like it. I still like that. But I am also a student. I'm always questioning what I know. I'm questioning what I read, but I'm delighting in that. So when I read that article, and I'm now reading his book too, and it's a terrific read. I love his work, but I'm reading it with that scrutiny. And I would hope anybody would do that with my work too, because it's really exciting to do that. You feel like you're having an internal conversation with the writer. And I think it's just more lively to do that. Just don't accept everything at face value and have a little fun with it. So in the end, when Joe Nye wrote me back and I said, I told him I was in the Finger Lakes, and he said, oh, what a beautiful part of the country. If you're going to be sheltering in place, I think that's one of the best to be. And that's just a little bit of humanity. It's a little bit of sharing that we had that I liked.
Well, you mentioned this notion of soft power, which is contrasted with the notion of hard power or dominance or coercion. And that, at least in Japan studies, that became articulated through this notion of cool Japan, which was really kind of a form of nation branding that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to try to market Japan in contrast to China, which was rising as the regional hegemon. The point being that, maybe China is more powerful economically and militarily, but Japan has culture. And, Japan's the coolest culture in the world. And the way that gets expressed, the examples of that are in its architecture, its design, its food culture, anime, manga, its popular culture. But you've done work on nation branding. How do you conceive of or think about this notion of the attachment here between soft power and cool Japan?
Oh, I write about that at length. in Japan's information war. It's a centerpiece of my book. Because long before, and the book, by the way, is based on my Abe Fellowship, ironically, because I often write about Abe, or at least the Abe administration policies. But the Abe Fellowship is in reference to a research fellowship that is sponsored by the Social Science Research Council using funds that were given by his father, Shintaro Abe, the longest serving foreign minister, to the Japan Foundation. And it goes to sponsor American scholars doing research on Japan, and then Japanese scholars doing research on the United States. And the intent is to lead to more coordination, cooperation. It has certainly fulfilled that intent for me, because I ended up living in Japan because of the Abe Fellowship. But with Cool Japan, it's a whole nother several hours to get into. The problem is the naming to begin with, and its derivative. There were 2 points I make. Cool is what others define as cool. So to say you're cool is really just uncool to begin with. And there's a lot about Japan that isn't that cool. And that's what we like. I mean, there's sort of the nerd factor that we like. There is the invisibility when you're there. I often joke with friends that I feel like I'm walking as an extra in a movie around Japan, and nobody's really paying any attention to me. Right. Which is really wonderful, because so many places I travel to, you do get a lot of eye contact. People are very overtly aware of you. And it's not that I think that people are just outwardly ignoring, but you're just designed. The cultural DNA in Japan is not to stare, especially at somebody who isn't like you. And so it gives me license to sort of go around. I feel like I'm a cultural anthropologist, and that I've learned a lot about the country, including Cool Japan, by being this extra in a movie or this participant observer. And remember, I'm doing this without the advantage of the language, which is a cost and a benefit, but it has heightened my sensitivity so that I'm able to read people beyond having the immediate language, other than the simple little getting around Japanese that I have. So it's been, so the second thing with the derivative is that Cool Japan, I read a lot of the reports that were coming out from MOFA and the Cool Japan Promotion Council and who was on that council. And I gave talks on this in many different venues to Japanese audiences. And I said, well, here's a part from the Cool Japan Promotion Council report that links Steve Jobs going to Japan to study Zen Buddhism to a rise in interest in Zen Buddhism in the United States. It was this causal link for which there was no evidence, but the fact that Steve Jobs was mentioned seemed a lot more important. It was that sort of kowtowing to celebrity. All we need are, well-known people to talk about us, and that'll make a difference. Well, that's not all you need. And you can compare Cool Japan to the Korea Wave. You can then look at China, where I've spent time teaching at Tsinghua and have taught courses in public diplomacy there. And we know with China that they spend a lot more, and they link the promotion more to the propaganda there as well. But are they getting a very good return on their investment? No. And they'll be the first to tell you that too. So Japan doing a lot less with a lower budget has in some sectors done very well. I did a series for the American Chamber of Commerce Journal called Voices of Japan, and I interviewed some of the Foreign Service people who were involved in the Cool Japan initiative called Japan House. And that seems to be a successful initiative because by design it was set up, Kyle, so that the fingerprints of the government would be off the initiative. The funding would come from the Japanese people through MOFA, but the actual bricks and mortar and the organization and the advisory board would be people from the community. So we now have a Japan House in London and in Los Angeles and in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I think it's been a good aspect to Japan getting outside of the country and really putting the mission of the country right there front and center in communities where there's a higher proportion of Japanese, but also Japan curious people.
Well, it's interesting that MOFA would not want its fingerprints on this, that it would try to have a degree or two of separation away from its funding and promotion of this and push it through some sort of NGO or a like-minded organization. But why would it want to have that kind of lack of association and distance?
Well, because hands off is very effective. I know, I worked for the government.
Well, what do you mean by hands off?
Official involved, or if you have, this is presented to you by MOFA. Don't you remember the Shared Values Initiative after 9/11? How effective was that? That was those 5 ads. You can still see them on YouTube, but produced under the tutelage of Charlotte Beers, who came out of Madison Avenue, J. Walter Thompson, Ogilvy and Mather, and she just sort of translated or converted what she had learned in advertising to the government. And these ads were telling the truth. They were real Muslim Americans, but it was paid for by the Department of State. And in the end, the distribution was limited because in the Muslim majority countries where the US government was hoping to have these ads run, the government said, this is paid political propaganda. We can't accept that. We can't show that. Yeah. So in the end, it got a lot of attention for all the wrong reasons. It also was a pictorial. As I said, it was true, but it was answering a question that wasn't even being asked. It was showing how well Muslim Americans were living in the United States. That was just pointing out the obvious disconnect between life for these people in the US versus those on the receiving end of American intervention, i.e. Afghanistan, Iraq, and feelings of being targeted in the war on terror.
Well, maybe I'm a little cynical, but the State Department... You do
sound a little cynical to me.
Well, let me make my point. If you have MOFA or the U.S. State Department who are able to go through these contortions to be able to, hide the fact that ultimately they're the people behind this, still you're dealing with propaganda. I mean, the truth is that this isn't something that's necessarily arising organically, but rather it's something that's being produced and manufactured for a political end. So when I talk to my students about the whole Cool Japan thing, this goes in both directions. You have American students who come here because of anime and manga, and they come here because Japan's cool. And when I ask them why is it cool, they say because of anime, manga, and these various consumer products that they're tapping into. And then you have a similar kind of thing. Ann Allison, the anthropologist at Duke, has written about this, these cross-cultural flows that go from Japanese young people reaching out to abroad because they're finding something that maybe they lack or can't get within their own culture. It's kind of a compensation for something that's lacking here. But in either case, they're tapping into something that they find of interest, but how is it presented to them and how is it packaged? And so what you're having here is it's a kind of cultural diplomacy. David Lehane, the political scientist previously at Princeton, now at Waseda, he gave a lecture about this recently. And he has a chapter in his most recent book called Cool Optimism. And he argues that these Cool Japan discourses, it's not really, as you mentioned, it's not really unique to Japan because every country that has a Ministry of Foreign Affairs has some version of this. They're always trying to promote their interests. but ultimately it's always self-referential. It's kind of an idealized presentation of the way they want to be perceived by other cultures. But the reason I'm a little critical of this is, what does that exclude? And what it excludes is the fact that a lot of times, these discourses are contended. It often leaves out, minorities, or in the case that you presented, it also leaves out gender or women's issues. So for me, it's just, for one thing, the lack of transparency of where this is coming from, but also what ends up being left out of the picture as a result.
Well, let me be clear, though, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was certainly proud of this initiative, or else they wouldn't have talked to me and I wouldn't have published it in the Chamber Journal. So they weren't hiding. But my point was to say that you do have to be very careful when it comes to cultural diplomacy or any public diplomacy that is too self-interested, too nation-state focused. A lot of public diplomacy inadvertently becomes diplomacy on your own publics. And I can tell you, when I worked at the U.S. Information Agency, it was an open-sourced propaganda agency. But everything we did there was for overseas consumption. That was made very clear to us. And that meant that once the internet was taking off in the early to mid-90s, if, say, a U.S. citizen called me up, happened to find me at the agency, and I answered the phone, and they asked me what our website address was, our URL, I couldn't give it to them by law. But they could just, at that time, no Google, but Alta Vista, or they could have searched for it. But it was set up with public diplomacy. There's always that sort of murkiness into propaganda, because the law of the United States and in many countries is that you can't propagandize your own people. But I knew from my travels abroad and over the years, the last 2 decades, during the height of the war in Iraq, the continuing conflict in Afghanistan, wherever I go, people ask me, how is it that your own people in the United States are often the most propagandized? They tend to rally around the flag when there's a war to be fought overseas, and yet your propaganda doesn't work very well on us abroad. And I said, well, it's sort of odd, because by design, it's supposed to be working on people overseas, and the people in your own country aren't supposed to be subject to it. But that's just one of the ironies. So as somebody who works for the government, I'm just saying I'm more in the middle. I'm not entirely cynical. I wouldn't disagree with this sort of cool optimism. You're not talking about a lot of money, though, in comparison to what we spend on hard power.
Yeah, but I guess my question of this is, why not have the courage of your convictions? If you're trying to push your values out there, why the lack of transparency? Why the deception?
We have transparency. I'm not sure.
But you're saying that they don't. You're saying that they don't. But you were saying that they don't have transparency because they can't announce the fact that actually they're in fact behind it.
No,
or they have to get these intermediary organizations in front of them so that people don't know where it's coming from. That's deception.
Wow. Okay, I'm not saying that. Actually, I'm saying that the way it's being run is by the people in the communities. So if you were to walk into Japan House, it's not going to have a huge banner saying presented to you by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, that's vulgar. That's a little too on the nose. Yeah.
I know, but there's not deception in the sense that this is covert. There's nothing covert about it. It's anything, if you looked it up, if you even went on Wikipedia, you would find out it comes from funding from the government. Public diplomacy always comes, ultimately, it's centered in the government. It's paid for by the public coffers. That's why we call it public diplomacy. Now, in the 21st century, we have a lot of non-state actors. We have a lot more international actors involved in this process. But it originated with the government, and the government outreach to publics. So it always comes through the public coffer. So there's not that deception there. My point had to do with sort of in public relations or in public communication. It's much more effective to have people at arm's length. Like if you're trying to make a point about, say, Japan's handling of the coronavirus, are you going to have Professor Suzuki from Hokkaido University make that point for you? Because he's an academic. He's at arm's length. He's going to be a lot more credible, even though he may be making a lot of points that the government would be making too.
Right.
Much less effectively.
You're referring to a recent panel that you had moderated about the Japan's response to the coronavirus crisis. Right. And this political scientist, I don't know if he has any coherent connection to the government, but he did seem to be promoting a version of their response to it that was probably consistent with the way the Abe administration wants to envision and project itself.
Well, his style is very effective because it's methodical, it's set up very scientifically and simply. And in the end, Professor Suzuki says, this is a model that is working well for Japan, but it's not really exportable. He makes that point too, which is interesting in that it may work for us, maybe because we're more unique. He even gets into the hygiene and the cultural habits of the people, and you can't really argue with that. And then the cluster tracing. So It is persuasive. And I don't know if he has any direct connection to the government, but I know, having worked for the government and having been on the inside, we liked that when we would have people who were not directly connected. And governments do this all the time with NGOs too. And there's often, of course, contention there too, but they do at times work together. And it's by design because they're going to be more credible actors. Whenever people feel like they're being talked to authentically, that there is no holding back, that we are being genuine in sharing, whether it's a criticism or it's praise, people respond to that usually in more favor. They find that it's more convincing. We don't like to always have sponsored information, even though we're in surround sound of sponsored information. So to that extent, that was my point about Japan House, that I thought it's been effective because it hasn't been so much of a tie to the administration, but rather a way to have more of a grassroots approach using the public monies of the Japanese government. I think the Japanese people would be pleased to see it and may want to actually go into these venues.
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is just, do you have an alignment of common interest? In which case, if you have a message that's consistent with the government being put forward by a non-government organization, then it is genuine. It's coming out of the commitments and values of that particular organization. In the case of Professor Suzuki, the kinds of critical questions that I would raise is, first of all, are those claims valid? The so-called Japan model of the way they're doing it, is that in fact a coherent model? Does it work? Or is it kind of backfilling and kind of a retrospective interpretation of a policy that wasn't very functional, and that this is the government's control of, it's a form of messaging of the control of the way they want their actions to have been perceived. So in that sense, the connection of the government here is important, because is he a shill for a government rhetoric and an agenda, or is this in fact coming out of, his own research? And I don't have an ability to evaluate that, but I think the question here of just whether or not you have common interests, and that's the fundamental thing. But let's talk a little bit more about Japan's messaging with regard to not only the coronavirus, but I think probably as the Olympics were coming forward before the coronavirus hit, that must have been the only thing that anyone was going to be talking about. And you, as a person who's dealt with public diplomacy, nation branding and such, the Olympics are the ultimate opportunity for that. So how did you see the preparations and the early messaging that was being done by Japan regarding the Olympics, and how that was undone by what happened with the coronavirus, Diamond Princess cruise ship, and this pandemic?
Well, I've been writing about this in the Nikkei Asian Review. And the first piece that I wrote that came out in February had to do with the Diamond Princess.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was followed by a piece by Koichi Nakano from Sophia University that was in the New York Times, where he made the point that if the government is unable to handle a cruise ship in Yokohama port, can we really trust it'll be able to handle the Summer Olympics? Because as you know, the Olympics were still going to happen. And I'm seeing this from New York State, from the United States, where things are really going awry here. And it looked like it was business as usual. And it was just, I was aghast at this because I thought they're going to lose the Olympics. It's just a matter of when they can make this decision. So what we got instead was this sort of gnashing of teeth of sort of deciding, how are we going to present this? Are we going to say we're waiting on the World Health Organization, which is what one of the messages was, or we can't make a decision because the IOC won't let us? Mm-hmm. And so ultimately, it had to come down to the host stepping forward and saying, after consulting with we have elected now on March 24th, I think it was, very late, to pull the plug. And we're just going to postpone. So it'll still be Tokyo 2020, but it'll be 364 days later. So not even one full year later from the original date. But I wrote 2 op-eds pleading with the government. This is my own little megaphone, are these op-eds, and saying you need to cancel the Olympics now as a way to enhance your own soft power. So this is all on my website, nancysnow.com, under my writings. You can read these articles, but they're becoming this archive of my response to the Japanese government's messaging. And it's sort of a public interest of mine, but also a public appeal that anybody can do. I think a lot of people could see what was happening. So
and what do you anticipate?
It did is that you lost some precious weeks there. And I think this impacted the reality now for the Japanese government that in a number of surveys, both domestic and global, Japan is ranked on the very low end in terms of its approval from the public to the government's handling of the COVID-19, despite the numbers, despite the success, despite the low mortality.
So how does it reverse that? If you were a consultant for the Japanese government, what would you suggest to them for how they can reverse that public opinion?
In what response are you referring to?
With regard to the coronavirus response and also the Olympics moving forward.
Well, I would give credit to the Japanese people. You always want to credit your front line. So this is a pandemic where we're all impacted, where citizen power is the superpower now, Kyle. So if I were Abe, or if I were the leadership in the government, I would thank the Japanese people for their efforts. Not just the frontline workers, but for everybody, with their behavior, with the 3 C's, as we've heard about, and the avoidance of the closed spaces with poor ventilation, or with massing in crowds, or close contact, limiting places where there's close contact. also accommodating oneself to this massive plunge now in the economy and Japan's recession. And so this is happening everywhere. It's a way of uniting us. And I would make a very prominent speech if I were Abe, and it would be full of humility, and it would be full of apology too, that the government didn't act when it should have acted, because I think eating crow a little bit can go a long way. We don't see that enough amongst our leaders.
Certainly not. I'm thinking about the United States.
You see it more in industry. I've said before in a number of interviews I've been doing, sitting here in my home, going on Zoom or talking to the media, that what has impressed me in the US has been the industry response, has been the heads of companies who are really putting themselves out there, and you see them sheltering in place, but talking about their company in a new light, where it's not just about growth and profit, where they've been scared now. We need our customers, but they're not talking in terms of units per. And it's really been heartening, because when I was in graduate school in the social sciences, we were often a little skeptical of profiteering and business and big business and just this GDP model that we were obsessed with. And I think we really have to get rid of that model, because we're living in a pandemic era that isn't going to go away. This isn't just we're going to cure ourselves now and then, back to business. I hope we don't go back to the way things were, because we can be so much better. So I think if Abe were to do something totally contrarian, because we've only seen him sheltering in place with his remote and his pet drinking tea, and we know that backfired. But if he were to show that humility and humanity and the connection from the government to the citizenry, I think the approval rating would go up. And it's just that it has come across that it's more about the LDP and his legacy, because, of course, he's looking for a successor now. I mean, living in Japan, it's not as if there is this potpourri of options in politics. It's a lot of same old, same old. So I think doing something against form, which is not typically Japanese, but it would get him out of his comfort zone. But again, I would put the focus on thank you to the Japanese people.
Not very likely. I mean, his legacy is tied, for one thing, to the Olympics, but also the way they've dealt with this crisis. And, he's likely to stay on brand. Of course, this brings up the way the United States has dealt with this. Do you think a similar kind of move by Donald Trump would be effective for him to show a little humility, to focus on the people who are on the front line, and to apologize for the way that they had handled it?
Well, again, that would be very contrarian for Donald Trump, wouldn't it? And part of Donald Trump's
I can hardly
appeal,
imagine such a thing.
Part of his appeal to his constituents, because all of the rhetoric now is going toward the fall election, and even had his son, Eric Trump, on the air defending his father, and Donald Jr. is often, there's this whole debate about vote by mail versus showing up in person. It's sort of like setting up the country for not holding an election. But I think we will have an election. And I think with Trump, he is in a position where he's going to continue to do what he's always done. He's very consistent. And it's about him. And it is about the way he handles things and thinking off the top of his head and tweeting and going after people, as we've seen. I don't know. I really don't think it's going to work this time, though, because I think there are enough people who are ready for this openness. As I said, there's something happening really at an environmental level, at a spiritual level. And I'm not talking religion, but I just think that we are seeing things more clearly now.
Well, at an existential level, it affects people and their loved ones, their work. You have interesting views on this. You had given a presentation at the university before the election in which you had more or less predicted that Trump would make it through because of his communication skills and his kind of unusual way of almost hypnotically being able to convey a certain kind of message. And so I think you have a great deal of insight into the mind of Donald Trump. So what brought him to power, you don't think is going to allow him to maintain his presidency? If you were betting on this, how do you think it's going to play out in the upcoming election?
Well, I think he's going to be one term. That's my prediction. And I don't think that will end polarization, but I think given the pandemic and sort of superordinate goals here, it will be less about Trump's winning or losing and more about what are we going to do going forward. So I think that he will possibly move on to maybe buy a network, TNN.
Right. To compete with Fox News.
Sure. And so, but I think that, my talk that I gave in 2016 was like stand-up comedy because that was a talk about how Trump was able to use persuasion and propaganda to make his bid for the presidency. And I did that because Robert Dujarric and many others were sort of just making fun of him. I mean, he was just a caricature. And I was not coming to his defense as a supporter. I was coming to his defense as an American character, really, in politics, who had a good chance of becoming president with absolutely zero political background.
Coming to defense is not maybe the right way of putting it. That you were trying to say that, love him or hate him, you have to understand why this person is a successful politician, right? But
yes.
I think,
Yes. And that's part of critical thinking too, Kyle. With our students, we want them to really address things, even if they feel like they disagree. I remember years ago that I had a lot of friends in Southern California. I still have those friends, but they hated Fox News, but they didn't know Fox News. They just knew they didn't want to watch Fox News. And so a website came along with the tagline, "We Fox News, so you don't have to." And they were channeling Fox News to these people who couldn't even stomach it. But that has always been my refrain, that you don't have to watch it and become addicted to it. You don't even have to listen to Trump all the time when it's such a turnoff, but you have to understand that he's a symptom and that there's a lot more percolating there. And that was my main point. But at the end, I had people lined up and a few of them were saying, man, I didn't like Trump at all. Now you've got me liking Trump. And I thought, oh my gosh, what just happened? But if you recall, we were laughing a lot. We were sort of having a good time. And this is what people know, that when you can get people to lower their defenses and to use those emotional shortcuts, you got them in the palm of your hand. And Trump is entertaining. We have to at least give him that. He's definitely entertaining.
It's professional wrestling is politics. And
that's right.
It's hard to look away.
That's right.
So I think your background, having grown up, being born in Georgia, and then, going to Clemson and having this Southern experience, I feel we're a little simpatico with this because I grew up in rural Missouri, which is very much Trump country. And I really tried to understand the point of view of family members, friends who support Trump. And one of the points I've tried to put forward to my students is, look, you have to establish something almost like empathy to be able to understand the contrary point of view. I love this line from the economist Tyler Cowen. He has a blog site where he has his 12 rules of life. And one of his 12 rules is, I don't know, just to have the humility of realizing that you don't know it all. But the other one that I tell my students, that this is Cowan's line, learn how to learn from those who offend you. Learn how to learn from those who offend you, which I think is a really brilliant statement.
That's
and
right.
You can only get there as if you can build some sort of bridge. I don't know if empathy is the right word, because when I talk to my students in my race course, I argued that the fundamental premise of racism is a lack of empathy. And so how are you going to be able to understand a person who is racist, without establishing some sort of empathy? And I think it's much easier just to draw these borders or lines, or to use Trump, to build a wall so that you never have to deal with the really genuinely struggle with the point of view of another person with whom you disagree.
Well, I really hope that what comes out of this experience, the shared experience that we're having now, is to draw upon these reservoirs and to nurture them, the better part of ourselves, the angels of ourselves. And I have a very religious background.
Yeah.
And that goes back to my formative years, as well as being immersed in a lot of the racial dynamics of the 70s, going through busing. And, I've been in a lot of situations where I had to think a lot about other people and their experience. Yeah. And this has led to my interest in telling people stories, not just my own, but also interviewing people. I love to find out, what's your story? And so I continue to do that, and I hope people will do that with each other. We are living, you and I, in a privileged perch. The fact that we're even connected now, and you're in Japan and I'm in the United States. So I give thanks every day for the gifts that I have to help to continue to communicate and be a global educator.
We've lived a very interesting life, Nancy. As I was going through your biography and trying to figure out how I could encapsulate that at the beginning, I realized that I didn't really have 10 minutes to give an introduction in an hour-long podcast, because you've lived such a complicated life. But with that comes very diverse experience. And, to the extent that you're empathetic, you learn different frames of consciousness and the way people live in different worlds. And I think that's expressed in your work. You've done about, 13 or more books by now?
Yeah, 13. But of course, I work with a lot of people. And so my latest two are co-edited volumes. One is the Sage Handbook of Propaganda. And my two co-editors are British scholars, so I learned a lot from them. And then we had, of course, contributors from all over the world. And then the other book, the Rutledge Handbook of Public Diplomacy, the second edition, is with Nick Cull, who is one of the leading scholars in public diplomacy in the world. He's based at USC, Southern Cal, the Annenberg School.
And you had taught there previously, right?
That's right. I taught there for many years. Jeff Cowan, who was the dean of the school, had been the director of Voice of America. And right after 9/11, we met at a brunch and we got talking. And I said to him, I'm a propaganda scholar. I'd love to teach a course on media and propaganda in this era. And so that's what I taught in the spring of 2002 to undergraduates. So I ended up doing these special topics courses, and they were my mainstay, and they were incredibly intense. But it was from those conversations that I was able to produce a number of books. So learned a lot from my students.
Well, in the aftermath of the 2001 terrorist attacks, I can't imagine having a more important area of study than propaganda. And who would have thought that a dozen years later or longer that they would be all the more relevant with what we're dealing with in the world, not only with the coronavirus, but the nature of international politics with all these reactionary nationalist governments that have come to power. Propaganda is a really central concern of our time.
It sure is. And when you're living in crisis, where there's a lot of uncertainty, all we have is now. We become vulnerable, all of us, to messages that are designed to manipulate and to misinform, to get our ire, to make our blood boil. And so we have to give ourselves every day contemplative space. And you know, Kyle, because we've talked about in our planning for today's talk, that I get up very early in the morning and I treasure this time now because it's so quiet and all I can hear are the birds and I can see the sun come up and it's very comforting. But I just sit here and I think. I don't go online. I just sort of maybe meditate a little bit. I did a 10-day meditation over the new year at the time when we really didn't know about the virus. Maybe this was a new virus in Wuhan. That's all we knew. But that taught me to seek that balance and to not go to extremes. And it's difficult. It's challenging every day. But that would be a tip that I would share, is that if you can, try to really get your sleep, but also rise early and give yourself some space just for your own solitude and your own thoughts.
Well, it sounds like you're coping with this much better than many of us. Nancy, I appreciate your perspective so much. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm really privileged to be on air with you, and I thank you for our conversation.
Well, thank you for taking the time. So be safe, and I'd very much like to talk to you as we get closer to the upcoming election or thereafter, because I think you have a lot of insight into this. But I'll look to your books. And
you take care.
Okay.
And I'll give a talk when my Japanese version comes out of Japan's Information War.
Sounds great.
All right.
Okay, Nancy. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us today. This podcast is an initiative of the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University Japan campus. To learn more about the Institute, please visit www.tuj.ac.jp/ICAS. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast for the next episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. 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 And see you next time.